It is with great pleasure that I have asked a great-granddaughter of Cyrus Dallin, and who has been a good friend and contributor to the museum, to read a remembrance of her mother, Ruth Dallin Stevenson, entitled Dallin's Studio. Please welcome Pat McCabe of New Hampshire.
I'm going to be reading today from an oral history of Cyrus Dallin and his home that was written by my mother, Ruth Dallin McCabe Stevenson. She was the granddaughter of Cyrus and Victoria Dallin. Her writings had been edited slightly just to make them flow a little better, but it's pretty much all her own words. So it begins. His house was at the corner of Oakland Avenue and Cliff Street. She notes that Cliff Street was a well-known named street because it was full of cliffs, rocky cliffs. The house had steps leading up from the sidewalk to a wide porch that went almost all around the house. One end was screened and furnished with porch furniture. His house was 69 Oakland Avenue, and across the street was our house at 84 Oakland Avenue. One entered through a glass entry where outside footwear was deposited. Another door opened into a wide hall. To the left was the music room, and to the right the drawing room. This room curved following the curve of the porch. Back of the drawing room was the dining room, with the butler's pantry connecting the dining room to the kitchen. From the hall, one climbed a wide staircase to the landing, which had a suit of armor and my grandmother's cedar chest. Grandpa put an Indian mask for a face on the armor, and at night I was terrified to go by it. The guest bedroom was on the left, and then the library. It had a round table over which hung a big Tiffany lamp. A large fireplace, bookcases lined the wall. Many of the books were about Indians or written by Indians. His desk was in the corner overlooking the street. Here he wrote business letters and letters to friends and relatives. I might note that he had many letters from his family asking for money. So much of his money went out to Utah to help family members. He also built a house for his mother in Springville. She originally was living in a 2-room cabin and raised all of her children in that cabin. So when he could, he built her the house. Cyrus read extensively and loved this room. It was here that he liked to play cards in front of the fire. It was usually a simple game like double Canfield. He made up the rules, and we played by his rules. Naturally, he won, and although we knew he cheated, we let him win. I really think he did this to see if we would let him get away with it, and we always let him, so he was happy. My grandmother's sewing room was between the library and the master bedroom. The 3rd floor had a large billiard table and his bows and arrows, as well as his target. For relaxation, he would either play billiards or use his bows and arrows. About the first thing I remember about my grandparents was being taught to read by my grandmother. She chose as a text the Song of Hiawatha by Longfellow. I can still remember the opening lines, and I remember as a child she used to quote those lines to me. It stayed with her all of her life. Her grandmother had been a school teacher. When she and my grandfather were courting, he would write her from Utah, and she would return his letters correcting the spelling and grammar. He never resented this and used her suggestions in subsequent letters. My grandmother, whom he referred to as his little Dresden doll, smoothed his rough edges, and he could converse with family and clients with ease. I remember him as a polished, well-spoken gentleman. As she was a teacher, and as his schooling was very limited, her assistance helped him immeasurably. I remember him speaking perfect English, and as he had beautiful manners, he was able to hold his own with others and in time with clients. He always said he got his love of beauty from his mother. His father worked a small gold mine, and because he resigned from the Mormon church, he was unable to hire Mormon workers, so he had to depend on his sons. Thus, one day, when Cyrus was helping to remove clay from the mine, he molded his first head. Now for my remembrances of the studio. It was only a short distance from the house. It was a fairly long wooden structure attached to the garage. One gained entrance by going up a couple of steps and turning right and entering through a door. A big cherry tree guarded the entrance. On entering, the first thing one would see would be a large wooden box holding his plasticine, the medium he used to make his models. As your eye scanned the room, you would see several pedestals holding figures on them. A bust of his mother and father in marble, a World War I figure. It may have depicted my Uncle Arthur, as he was an ambulance driver during that war. Abraham Lincoln, and others that I cannot name now. His working table had a top that could be turned easily. You might even see him on a ladder with a larger-than-life piece. He had a pail of plasticine on the paint shelf. Of course, he worked from an armature, loading that with medium and working away to refine the piece with his modeling tools. This was the room the boys came into after school. Many afternoon, my husband's cousins were among the group. He handed each of them a hunk of plasticine and told them to make something with it, but be quiet and let him work. They all loved him and called him Grandpa Dallin, as did everyone in the neighborhood. At my 50th high school reunion, several of the men came up to me and recalled the days they spent at his feet. He always worked in a greenish smock, wore a tam that my grandmother crocheted for him. She kept him supplied with tams. My grandmother started a hobby club for the boys, and my father and other neighborhood kids belonged. My father developed a keen interest in radio, and not only was a hobby, but he used it in his business life also. He had many inventions dealing with radios, including transistor radios and radar. And I remember as a kid when we went to visit my grandmother and grandfather, he was always on his radio. It was one of the enduring hobbies that he had. My grandmother also started the Women's Club and the Study Club. My grandparents were entertained a great deal, so in order to repay these social obligations, she would have formal teas. We three girls were asked to help by handing around cups of tea and passing cookies and cakes. My grandfather always attended, and he would always take a group through the studio. Thanksgiving was celebrated at their house. My father had to drive to Beacon Hill to pick up Grandma's two sisters, and as long as he lived, the brother also. One of my great aunts couldn't resist needling Grandmother, who would burst into tears and have to leave the table. We had about 13 at the table and only one maid. And as Grandma insisted on formal service, it took a long time to be served. When we were old enough, we helped by passing vegetables, etc. Finger bowls always completed the dinner. I forgot to tell you that he placed an Indian on the high cliff at the back of the garden called, I think, the Last Arrow. It was only plaster, but it stayed there for several years before it literally washed away. We did have many cliffs around. I think he selected the property because it reminded him of his beloved Wasatch Mountains in Utah. He painted these mountains several times. Perhaps I can tell you a bit about the man. He was not very tall and he used a cane only to point at something. I told you about the time at the art museum when he shook his cane and said, "That's not art." Many Sunday afternoons we would drive Grandpa and our family to the art museum and follow him around, listening to him talk about the paintings. A group of people always followed us. Another example of how he interacted with children in the neighborhood, he came upon a group of boys throwing stones in the woods, and he said to them, "See how I throw?" And then he proceeded to draw a circle on one of the trees and throw a stone, hitting the middle of the target. The boys thought that looked like fun and tried it, and decided that was what they wanted to do. Coming home at night from the art museum, he would wait at Harvard Square for the Arlington Heights trolley car, or streetcar. I also used to take the same streetcar. He usually got there before I did, so when I got on, no seats. I would spot him and hold on to the back of his seat so we could talk. He would not let me stand. After I said no a couple of times, he said, "A gentleman never sits when a lady is standing." So that was that. After we got to the last stop at Arlington Heights, we would walk home together. My mother was a good cook, and when she made an apple pie, she would phone Grandpa to say his piece was waiting for him, so he would come over and enjoy a piece of pie and cheese. My mother always ate cheese with her apple pie. My grandmother would not serve apple pie. She considered it Parisian. Many times I would go over in the afternoon and check what they were having for dinner. If it was better than our menu, I'd call home and tell Mother I was staying for dinner. So you see, there was a lot of travel between the two houses. He told a story about a trip east with a chief and many of his Indians. After they went through the first tunnel, Grandpa looked around. No Indians. All, including the chief, were under their seats. Grandpa tried to explain to the chief using sign language. So after the second tunnel, the chief was sitting, grabbing the arms of the seat so hard his hands were white, and all the other Indians were again under their seats. They were going to see the Great White Father in Washington. He and Martin Bovey were close friends and traveled one year to Utah together. Martin lived next to us, and he skied our driveway and built a jump at the end. When Arthur started his stained glass business, he used part of the studio. First, he built a second floor over the garage, which he used for his office and workroom. He hung the cartoons for display. Then, if accepted, he would cut the glass on a long table on the floor of the garage. His kiln was on the back wall of the garage. The glass was painted on to get the proper colors he needed, and then it was fired in the kiln, taken out, leaded, and returned to the kiln. He had a flourishing business when the Second World War broke out, and because he was a French citizen as well as an American, he chose to heed the call to the colors. He was 40 years old and too old to join the regular French army, so he joined the French Foreign Legion. He was killed and left a family who mourned him, and he was lost also to the art world. My grandparents never got over his needless death. They tried to stop him from going, but of course didn't succeed. He never married. It just left the rest of the family to miss him. Ruth Dallin Stevenson.